I had a friend in undergrad who grew up on North 7th Street. He was Polish American. I was in the East Village for 6 months in a tiny, crappy apartment. He just said, you should really check out, the first stop on the L train. And I'd never been out here before, and came out, drew a circle on the map around the Bedford Avenue stop, and that day I found about 6 or 7 places, and I moved into this building where I paid $150 a month for the whole building, and I got a 10-year lease.
What year was that?
That was 1980. And I had that moment in my life which I'd wanted, which was, the older generation had it in Tribeca and in Soho, where you just go to a factory building and the landlord just could not imagine that you'd want to live in an abandoned factory. And this neighborhood was so desolate at night, and he was just happy to have someone looking over his factory. It really seemed far away back then. I mean, I would tell people that I was going to Manhattan, they'd say, you going to the city? And it's just, this is only, this is 27 years ago, but it really was a different mindset. This is a photograph which I didn't take. It's actually was given to me of a flower arrangement from Japan of quite a well-known arranger, Sofu Teshigahara, and this will be motorized and mechanized, and so the motor here will be moving these panels slowly, so it actually deconstructs and sort of looks like that a lot, but these are constantly shifting. And then there is one moment when it registers and it looks like that. I'd used motors and lights principally since I started showing in 1983 at Artist Space. It was my first show. The work always did have a relationship to what was mechanically creating a representation. Sometimes that representation would be projected onto a screen. Sometimes that representation would just be, the performance itself that would sort of flatten out. I learned how to do all the stuff I was doing just from the store owners on Canal Street. They were so, generous, and I didn't know really how to wire up a light bulb, and I'd go in there, and it was pretty desolate back then. Canal Street, it was, it wasn't the pirated, CD, Louis Vuitton, Gucci industry that it is now, and it was just a kind of a sleepy industrial surplus neighborhood. And I'd go in there and buy the owners a beer, and they'd sit down with me and draw out diagrams, and that's how I really learned how to make what I'm making. That was my school. I mean, the space had been abandoned for 20 years, so it was a wreck. It was really a wreck. I lived without a toilet for almost 6 months, and I had a wood-burning stove. So I used to go out, like with my truck, and collecting wood pallets, bringing them home, chopping them up with a chainsaw and sticking them in the wood stove. With Planet Thailand, they started in Greenpoint, and then they opened a small little restaurant on Bedford Avenue, and then they opened this big place. And when they did, they asked me to design the fountain.
How'd they know you?
They actually knew me through my friend Julius, who was the general contractor on this job. And they didn't know me. They just basically, they said they wanted a fountain, and Julius said, you gotta look at my friend John's work. So that's how it happened. Well, the idea was to make a fountain with a boat. I was determined to do it without a motor. So I guess the idea started with the idea of maybe a rowboat. I happened to have found a large boat which had 2 sets of oars, and then the symmetry of the 4 oars sort of found itself. And then I used the principle of a Japanese, this is quite common in a Japanese garden, which would be a bamboo cup, which would fill up with water, and then the weight of the water would tip the cup over, and it would make a knocking sound. Just a sort of typical Japanese idea of just like the small sound, you're aware of it, it keeps time, and so when the cups fill up, actually the oars move, and then when the cups release the water, the oars move back down. So it's a constant sort of moving piece. The last element was the duck, which is actually a taxidermy duck that, oh my God, this was such a crazy trip going to a taxidermist in the Bronx. I found in the Yellow Pages, and I go back there, and it was mostly rats. He had mostly taxidermy rats, and then this one duck. I called him on the phone. He said he had a duck, and I go there, and then I put a life preserver on him, and he's wearing a little sailor cap, and he's walking the plank.
You ever get mugged on the street?
Yeah, I wasn't mugged, but I was. I had a knife to my throat. Yeah, right at my driveway, and it turns out I looked at. The guy puts a knife to my throat. It was, and he was the guy from Joe's Busy Corner. The girls, slice him up, Jimmy, slice him up. And I'm like, I got a knife here, and I'm like, you're the guy from Joe's Busy Corner. You know, they could have slit my throat. No one would have found me over here for like, you know, for a few days. It wasn't until after 9/11 really that the work changed with the use of video, and had in mind a piece which was in the PS1 show called 1 Hour Photo. Just really, I couldn't get the image of the cockpit, what the terrorists saw on 9/11. I couldn't get it out of my head, and I decided to actually create it. I used a surveillance camera in order to make that scene come to life using postcards of the World Trade Center. And that's when the work really shifted and took a turn. And all of a sudden I had this duality between the mechanisms and the monitors. And that's when the work sort of got a new life, I would say, like a new pair of legs. The research that I did for the show, I feel like wasn't really anything special. Having lived in America in the last 4 years, that we were all sort of, you know, experiencing, you know, day to day, all the sort of the lies and all the deceit and the sort of the shock at things like, well, Bush winning the first time around and then Bush winning again the second time around. It was an incredible disappointment and shock to me. I think the show does encapsulate a certain amount of rage that I have, and disappointment, but also a certain alienation that I have, the country in some ways being stolen from me, and that the Constitution is being stolen from us, and that in a funny way, this show, had you told me that I'd be making this show 4 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. And I feel in some ways I'm sort of like Michael Douglas in Falling Down, or, you know, Henry Fonda in The Wrong Man or something, being pushed until this happens. And I'm just reacting to what's coming upon me. It was almost like a diary, you know, just like me processing all of that information, all of that day-to-day existence in America, you know, from 9/11 to the buildup of the war to Hurricane Katrina to, you know, lots of connections that were happening, you know, and coming to the studio, and really sort of for the first time in maybe in a very long time, you know, where I was just working very, very intuitively, very immediately, and, you know, very, very quickly actually, and then not even processing it so much, you know, really just consciously sort of like knowing that as I was working, I was getting my confidence back, and my intuition was, you know, being restored, and I was just going to let it flow, and that's what I did. Toys have been something that's been very consistent in my work since the beginning. You know, I think of the necessity in this work to play. It doesn't come off didactic, and there's a level sort of play that disarms the viewer. And then you can sort of, on top of that, lay on any content you want. And I think there's a certain power in the sort of, you know, the simplicity of the mechanism, but then the image that you see on the screen is actually quite sophisticated. I wanted people to be suspicious of the images that they're getting. I think you have to constantly be questioning, how those images are coming at you, why they're coming at you, connecting the dots back to what the media has in some ways is constructing for you. And these pieces are all there. There's not a single thing in that show that is not in the room if you have the energy and the will to deconstruct it. When I'm working on a show, I don't know, especially one of these big shows like the show I'm planning is in scope is going to be a very ambitious project like the Palace of 4 AM, and I don't know what it's going to be like before I start. And I really do feel like I'm finding my way, in the dark and just gathering evidence and gathering, forensic, information, bits and pieces like after the bombing in order to put it back together, the scene of the crime. The show's called 1010, The Time Was Now. And there's going to be photographs I'm working on, there's going to be sculptural installations, there's going to be lots of monitors all over the room, so it's very, very crowded. These are very large. These are these paper pulp pieces I'm working on, which these will be, covering the walls of suicide bombers. Then you walk in and it's sort of all about time. Here's the time, it's 10:09. This is like a minute before the moment of detonation. These will just be covering the walls.
They're all 10:10.
They're all 10:09, 10:09, 10:08, 10:09. And it's really how the advertisers choose to portray the watch face, because it's kind of like a happy face, right? And it still shows the logo. So I'm just, taking advantage of that fact and sampling and using that and stealing the watch ads for my show. The whole center of the show is going to be these sort of like the atrocity exhibition of, using figurines, mostly soldiers, to create these events. And here's one where the soldiers just covered in crude oil. There's the one that you saw where he's being dragged along the floor. And I've just started to compose these. And then there's this guy. He's an aging hippie, waking up, sort of on the beaches of California, suntanned and long gray hair, maybe with a bottle of Ripple in his hand, and then he morphed into a kind of much more kind of complicated political character. He figured very prominently in the Palace at 4 AM, and he became a piece called Evolution, where he became a right-wing senator, and he was on a blog site kissing the troops in Baghdad and waking up in the burning embers of the World Trade Center. But now he's really sort of turned into just everything. He's the mashup that I sort of like, I collide him with all the characters that I'm working with. But his voice is gone. He's trying to speak, trying to communicate, and all of those sounds, those motor sounds, those servo motors are actually going to be picked up with little microphones that are on his face, and they're going to be, coming through the sound system. So it'll be loud. It'll be a sort of a loud whirring, whizzing motor sound. I'm not glorifying this, but I really want there to be this feeling when you walk into the show that death is imminent, or that it's somehow suspended in that moment just before death, in order to make you feel completely alive. So the work, you can see, has changed a lot. Flowers and beauty. Although I think the work is quite beautiful still.